There's a quiet irony in most modern kitchens today. Shelves crammed with supplements, pill organizers standing at attention like tiny soldiers, medicine cabinets bursting with products that drain your wallet and arrive with pages of side effects printed so small they require magnification to read. Yet sitting forgotten in the back of a fridge somewhere or quietly bubbling in a mason jar on a counter is something ancient civilizations valued above gold. Something that needed no laboratory, no patent, no prescription. Just salt, time, and the wisdom of the living world. While the modern food industry has spent the past century mastering the art of killing food, pasteurizing it, sterilizing it, processing it into something that survives 3 years on a shelf unchanged, ancient cultures did the opposite. They kept food alive. And the bacteria, enzymes, organic acids, and bioactive compounds inside that living food kept them alive in return. Today we're counting down 15 fermented foods from ancient tradition that modern science is still racing to understand. Pay attention to number 1. And when we reach number 8, I'll share a healing recorded in one of humanity's oldest texts that, viewed through modern biochemistry, reads less like poetry and more like a clinical report. Number 15, sauerkraut, the probiotic that crossed oceans. The Book of Numbers records the Israelites carrying salted preserved food through desert journeys. Salt-preserved fermented vegetation was ancient survival technology, practiced across nearly every civilization that needed to keep food alive through scarcity. The Chinese fermented cabbage 2,000 years ago to feed Great Wall laborers. Roman legions carried it on campaigns. German sailors prevented scurvy with barrels of sauerkraut centuries before James Cook used citrus, a fact Cook himself documented as keeping his crew alive on Pacific voyages. What those cultures preserved without knowing why is something modern science can now describe precisely. Raw unpasteurized sauerkraut produced through lactofermentation contains lactobacillus bacteria reaching into the billions per serving, vitamin C, vitamin K2, glucosinolates with documented anti-cancer activity in laboratory studies, and organic acids that reduce gut inflammation. A landmark Stanford study found a fermented food diet increased microbiome diversity more effectively than even a high-fiber diet. Here's the detail most people miss. The sauerkraut on grocery store shelves has been pasteurized. The heat that makes it shelf-stable kills every live culture. What you want lives in the refrigerated section or in your own mason jar. Pack shredded cabbage with 1 to 2 teaspoons of non-iodized salt per pound, press until brine rises above the vegetable, cover loosely, leave at room temperature for 5 to 7 days. Eat 2 to 4 tablespoons daily and never throw away the brine. It's as medically active as the cabbage itself. Number 14, kimchi, the immune army in a clay pot. Korean cuisine understood functional food long before science caught up. Kimchi, fermented cabbage and radish with chili, garlic, ginger and fish sauce, was never designed to be comfortable. It was designed to be functional. Korean culinary tradition stretching back over 2,000 years produced dozens of varieties simultaneously maintained in clay pots called ongi buried underground for stable cool temperatures. Diversity itself was considered as important as the kimchi. That diversity strategy has a precise scientific explanation. Kimchi produces a range of lactobacillus strains, most notably Lactobacillus kimchii, found in few other foods. Studies document its effects on immune modulation, cholesterol reduction, insulin sensitivity, and inflammatory cytokines. Here's what most wellness sources omit. The garlic contributes fructosaccharides, prebiotic fibers that feed the probiotic bacteria you're delivering simultaneously. Kimchi doesn't just deposit bacteria in your gut. It sends them in with food. Chili capsaicin adds anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties. Ginger contributes gingerols and shogales supporting circulation and easing nausea. A few tablespoons with every meal, multiple varieties on the table at once, the way traditional Korean households served it. Number 13, kefir, the ancient drink that outperforms yogurt. The pastoral world of the Old Testament was built around fermented dairy. Without refrigeration, fresh milk fermented within hours. What ancients drank, gave their children, and offered honored guests was fermented milk, culture-rich and probiotic-dense. In the Caucasus mountain region, kefir made by culturing milk with kefir grains, symbiotic colonies of bacteria and yeast that resemble small cauliflower florets, produces a drink containing 20 to 60 distinct probiotic strains. Commercial yogurts contain 2 to 7. This isn't a marginal difference. It's a categorically different food. The Caucasian peoples who maintain this tradition were among the longest-lived populations ever documented, with lifespans routinely reaching 100 years and beyond, kefir a daily fixture without exception. Modern clinical trials confirm what they demonstrated empirically. Kefir actually colonizes the gut, reduces lactose intolerance symptoms because bacteria predigest the lactose, improves IBS symptoms and reduces inflammatory markers. Here's what most overlook. Kefir grains require whole unskimmed milk to maintain culture diversity. Drink 1 cup daily of the real thing, thinner than yogurt, slightly carbonated, sour enough to make you pay attention. Number 12. Kombucha, the living detox. Fermented teas and tonics appear repeatedly in ancient medical and ceremonial contexts. Kombucha, sweet tea fermented over 1 to 3 weeks by a SCOBY, has documented history across China, Russia, and Eastern Europe spanning 2,000 years. It entered Western medical literature in the early 20th century when German and Russian researchers studied its effects on digestion and liver function. Fermentation produces organic acids, primarily acetic and glucuronic, with documented liver-supportive and detoxification mechanisms. Glucuronic acid binds to toxins and helps eliminate them through kidneys and bile, the biochemical reality beneath the traditional cleansing claim. Kombucha also delivers B vitamins and antioxidants from tea polyphenol. Its probiotic content runs lower than kefir or sauerkraut, but its organic acid profile gives it a distinct therapeutic role. Look for raw unpasteurized kombucha with live cultures and sugar under 5 grams per serving. Drink 4 to 8 ounces before a meal as a digestive tonic, not unlimited daily soda. Targeted, purposeful, small doses. Number 11. Traditional full-fat yogurt, the probiotic baseline. Here's a distinction that changes everything. The yogurt the ancient world ate, strained, full-fat, fermented 12 to 24 hours until cultures truly proliferated, is fundamentally different from today's fruit-flavored, low-fat, heat-treated product. They share a name. They don't share a function. Multiple civilizations, Greek, Middle Eastern, South Asian and Central Asian, independently developed yogurt-style fermented dairy, each recognizing it as medicine for the sick, restorative for the elderly, foundational for general health. That convergence across separate cultures is itself evidence. Randomized trials on genuine cultured yogurt show it shortens infectious diarrhea, supports recovery after antibiotics, and reduces antibiotic-associated infections by repopulating disrupted gut flora. Full-fat fermented dairy contains conjugated linoleic acid, anti-inflammatory and useful for body composition. Stripping the fat removes that compound entirely. The Greek and Middle Eastern practice of straining yogurt into labna increases protein and probiotic density. Eat it with olive oil and herbs the way it was meant to be eaten, not drowned in fruit syrup and granola. Number 10. Miso, the enzyme factory Japan kept for 1,000 years. Ezekiel chapter 4 describes grain cakes and fermented preparations with culinary specificity unusual for scripture, suggesting fermented grains were recognized as medicine. Japan developed miso, soybeans fermented with rice or barley using a mold called Aspergillus oryzae, over 1,000 years ago. The practice never wavered. Daily miso soup at breakfast remains among the most consistent dietary habits in the population with the world's longest documented life expectancy. Here's what most sources omit. Long-aged miso, fermented 2 to 3 years rather than weeks, contains dramatically higher concentrations of bioactive compounds. Fermentation transforms soybeans through enzymatic breakdown, producing a food rich in digestive enzymes and free amino acids. Fermentation also reduces phytic acid that blocks mineral absorption, explaining why traditional Asian cultures eating soy daily didn't develop the mineral deficiencies sometimes linked to unfermented Western soy. Studies show miso specifically reduces inflammatory markers and supports beneficial gut bacteria. The 1,000-year preparation rule traditional cooks never broke. Dissolve into hot but not boiling liquid, about a teaspoon per cup of warm broth. Number 9. Raw aged cheese, the forgotten probiotic. Hard aged cheese in the ancient world wasn't a delicacy. It was a preserved concentrated food source for people needing caloric density and stability. What the ancient world preserved was alive. Aged raw milk cheeses, traditional Parmesan, raw milk cheddar, aged Gouda, Roquefort, Manchego, contain active bacterial cultures that survive in the cheese matrix and reach the gut intact. A fact that decades of industrial dairy processing has nearly obscured. Studies on aged raw cheeses show meaningful counts of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. But here's what most sources omit. The aging process produces short-chain fatty acids that directly feed colonocytes, the cells lining your colon. Aged cheese is also one of the richest dietary sources of vitamin K2 in 7 Malawian Caucasus form, the most bioavailable variety, which directs calcium into bones rather than arteries. K2 deficiency has been linked to arterial calcification, osteoporosis and cardiovascular disease. An ounce or two as part of a meal the way Europeans ate it for centuries. A condiment, not a centerpiece. Number 8, sourdough bread, the ancient loaf that digests itself. Here we arrive at the story I promised. In 1 Kings chapter 19, the prophet Elijah collapses under a broom tree in the Negev desert. He's been running for his life, has gone a day's journey into the wilderness, lies down and asks to die. He hasn't eaten in what appears to be an extended period. His body is in a state modern medicine would recognize as starvation, dehydration, and acute psychological crisis simultaneously. An angel appears twice. Each time it touches him and says, "Arise and eat." What waits for him both times, described with unusual specificity, is a cake baked on coals and a cruse of water. That isn't poetry. In modern physiological terms, that's a precise description of cellular restoration. A body depleted of glycogen, electrolytes, and energy substrate receiving exactly what it needs, complex fermented grain carbohydrates. The text records that after eating, he rose and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights. Real sourdough, not bakery versions made with commercial yeast in 2 hours, is bread leavened exclusively by wild yeast and lactobacillus, fermented 8 to 48 hours. During that fermentation, lactobacillus consumes sugars that would otherwise spike blood glucose, produces acids that break down phytic acid blocking zinc, iron, and magnesium absorption, and partially digests gluten proteins. Studies comparing real long-fermented sourdough to conventional bread show lower glycemic response, better mineral absorption, and improved digestibility. Some with non-celiac gluten sensitivity tolerate it without symptoms. The bread Elijah ate was almost certainly close to this. Whole grain flour, a maintained sourdough starter, 12 to 24 hours. The fermentation is the medicine. Number 7, kvass, the blood tonic most have never heard of. The medicinal role of fermented beverages spans nearly every ancient culture, and kvass is one of the most potent the West has forgotten. It's a traditional Eastern European fermented beverage used medically across Russia, Ukraine, and Poland for centuries. Bread kvass, the original, is a low-alcohol probiotic drink made by fermenting rye bread crusts in water. Beet kvass is what medical literature finds more interesting. Fermented raw beets in salted water, traditionally used for liver conditions, sluggish digestion, and anemia. Here's the compound-level detail most miss. Fermentation concentrates betalains, the red pigments with antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects, while enhancing dietary nitrate bioavailability. The body converts these nitrates through oral bacteria into nitric oxide, which dilates blood vessels, improves circulation, and reduces blood pressure. Randomized controlled trials show genuine systolic blood pressure reductions of 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury, comparable to certain pharmaceutical interventions. Lactofermentation adds lactobacillus and increases iron and folate bioavailability, making beet kvass relevant for iron deficiency. 4 ounces before meals. Earthy, slightly sour, deeply mineral and acquired taste. Number 6, fermented hot sauce, the metabolic fire. Pepper cultivation appears across Mesoamerican, African, and Asian traditional medicine with consistency suggesting independent discovery of the same biological truth. Fermented hot sauce, made by lacto-fermenting fresh peppers with salt over 3 to 7 days before blending, is meaningfully different from commercial vinegar-based hot sauce. Fermentation produces live lactobacillus cultures while concentrating capsaicin. Capsaicin binds to TRPV1 receptors in the gut lining, triggering increased thermogenesis, with studies showing elevated metabolic rate for hours afterward, stimulation of digestive enzymes, appetite modulation through ghrelin and satiety signaling, and direct antimicrobial activity against H. pylori, a major driver of gastric ulcers. There's an additional layer most omit. Recent research identified an interaction between capsaicin and short-chain fatty acid production in the gut. Fermented pepper preparations appear to stimulate butyrate-producing bacteria, and butyrate is among the most studied protective compounds in gut health, linked to colon cancer prevention and intestinal barrier integrity. A tablespoon or 2 on food at meals. Mexican, Korean, and West African cuisines all feature fermented pepper preparations. These weren't flavor accidents. They were functional foods built into culture over generations. Number 5, fermented garlic and honey, the immune legend. Honey and garlic both appear separately throughout ancient medical and sacred texts with frequency suggesting their value wasn't theoretical. They were used daily by people who needed them to work. Fermenting them together is something herbalists across Asian and European traditions understood empirically. We now understand it biochemically. The enzymatic environment of raw honey, with its hydrogen peroxide-producing glucose oxidase, low water activity and antimicrobial peptides, creates conditions that transform raw garlic over 4 to 8 weeks. Allicin, garlic's primary active compound, becomes more stable and bioavailable. Antimicrobial honey compounds concentrate. Naturally occurring microbiota on both initiate slow fermentation producing additional bioactive compounds. Clinical research on garlic shows reduced cold and respiratory infections, lower blood pressure, lower LDL cholesterol, and broad-spectrum antimicrobial activity including against some antibiotic-resistant strains. Raw honey shows antibacterial, antiviral, and wound-healing properties. The detail most get wrong. The garlic must be raw, freshly peeled, not pre-minced. The honey must be raw and unfiltered, still containing live enzymes and pollen. Pasteurized honey won't ferment the same way. Submerge whole peeled cloves in raw honey, leave at room temperature 4 to 8 weeks, burping occasionally. 1 to 3 cloves daily during cold and flu season, more at illness onset. Number 4. Apple cider vinegar with the mother, the blood sugar regulator. Vinegar appears in scripture in contexts often missed. In Ruth 2 verse 14, Boaz invites Ruth to dip her morsel in the vinegar at a meal. Vinegar was food, medicine, a daily presence at the ancient table. Real apple cider vinegar with the mother is the endpoint of double fermentation. Apples ferment first to hard cider, then a second fermentation converts alcohol to acetic acid. The mother, the bacterial colony responsible, remains visible as a cloudy stringy mass when not filtered or pasteurized. Multiple controlled trials show consuming 1 to 2 tablespoons before a high-carb meal reduces post-meal glucose spikes 15 to 30%. The mechanism is well documented. Acetic acid inhibits alpha-amylase, the enzyme breaking starch into glucose. Studies also show improved insulin sensitivity over time, reduced fasting glucose, and meaningful triglyceride effects. Here's the additional mechanism rarely discussed. Apple cider vinegar stimulates gastric acid production in people with hypochlorhydria, low stomach acid, a condition affecting a significant percentage of adults over 60 and profoundly underdiagnosed. Low stomach acid drives chronic bloating, inadequate protein digestion, mineral malabsorption, and pathogen susceptibility. 1 teaspoon in 8 ounces of water 15 minutes before meals. Never undiluted. The acidity damages tooth enamel and the esophagus over time. Number 3. Natto, the most underrated cardiovascular food on earth. The idea that fermented soybean preparations had specific cardiovascular effects was part of traditional Japanese medical practice long before anyone isolated the compound responsible. Natto, fermented soybeans made with Bacillus subtilis, produces a compound called nattokinase. This enzyme, found nowhere else in the food supply, has been shown in clinical trials to dissolve fibrin, the protein-forming blood clots, with mechanisms researchers compare favorably to pharmaceutical thrombolytics. It directly reduces thrombosis risk, lowers blood viscosity, and works through a pathway distinct from common anticoagulants with a significantly different safety profile. For anyone concerned about cardiovascular risk, these findings are among the most clinically significant in fermented food research. The detail most sources omit. Nattokinase is heat-sensitive. Commercial natto supplements are processed at temperatures researchers found significantly reduce activity. The only way to guarantee biologically active nattokinase is the food itself eaten at or below body temperature. Don't heat natto. Eat it cold or at room temperature, traditionally over warm rice. Natto is also the single richest dietary source of vitamin K2 in 7 Malawian kwacha's form, providing over 300 micrograms per serving versus the 30 to 50 most researchers recommend. K2 directs calcium out of arteries and into bones. Natto handles both simultaneously. The flavor and texture genuinely challenge first-timers. 50 to 100 grams over rice several times weekly. Number 2. Fermented beetroot, the circulation supercharger. Beneath whatever spiritual application Isaiah 40 verse 31 carries lies a physiological reality fermented beetroot addresses directly. The nitrates in beets, concentrated further through lactofermentation, are converted by oral bacteria into nitric oxide, the molecule responsible for vasodilation, improved oxygen delivery to muscles, and enhanced cardiovascular endurance. Randomized trials on beetroot consumption show genuine improvements in time to exhaustion, oxygen efficiency, and recovery, robust enough that beetroot preparations are now restricted by some elite sports regulatory bodies, an unusual confirmation about a vegetable's potency. Here's the preparation detail even serious sources get wrong. Raw fermented beets retain dramatically higher levels of active betalains and bioaccessible nitrates. Heat degrades both significantly. The traditional Eastern European preparation, raw beets, filtered water, a small amount of non-iodized salt, a few days at room temperature, is both simplest and medically superior. No cooking. The brine after 3 to 5 days is the most concentrated form. 3 to 4 ounces daily before activity or as a morning tonic. Fermentation adds lactobacillus and increases iron and folate bioavailability, useful for iron deficiency fatigue or inadequate folate intake, more common in adults over 50 than most realize. The color will alarm you. Your urine and occasionally stool will turn deep pink red. That's the betalains being processed. That's the food working. Number 1. Raw unpasteurized lacto-fermented vegetables, the foundation that was always there. Most people watching this have had something fitting this category in their kitchen at some point. A jar of pickles, a container of sauerkraut, something a grandmother made that sat in the back of the fridge smelling sharp and sour and alive. Used as a condiment, ignored or thrown away during a move. The lacto-fermented vegetable, cucumber, carrot, radish, turnip, green bean, cauliflower, any vegetable preserved in salted brine through natural lactobacillus fermentation, is perhaps the most ancient prepared food in human history. It appears in nearly every culture that ever existed under different names with different spices, but with the same mechanism. Salt, water, thyme, and microbial intelligence. The distinction determining whether these foods do anything for your health is this. Was vinegar added or did acidity develop through live fermentation? Virtually every pickle in standard grocery aisles uses distilled white vinegar. It's not fermented food. It's acidified food. No bacteria involved. No bacteria survived. Shelf-stable, predictable, medically inert. Real lacto-fermented pickles are made with cucumbers, filtered water, and non-iodized salt. The salt creates an environment where lactobacillus naturally present on the cucumber skin thrives, producing lactic acid and preserving the vegetable through genuine biological transformation. They live in the refrigerator. They smell alive because they are. Studies show they increase beneficial gut bacteria density and diversity, contain meaningful vitamin C and B vitamins produced during fermentation, and deliver organic acids shifting the gut environment in favor of beneficial bacteria. The brine is medically active and should never be discarded. Athletes use pickle brine for rapid muscle cramp relief, which researchers have linked to a neural reflex triggered by acidic compounds. You can make these at home with a mason jar, vegetables, salt, and water. Check any jar in your refrigerator now. If the first acidic ingredient is vinegar, it isn't what your body is asking for. If the only acid is lactic acid produced by the bacteria themselves, that's the real thing. One principle runs through every item on this list, and it's the most important thing I can leave you with. Quality isn't a preference. Quality is the medicine. The active compounds in everything we've discussed, the live lactobacillus in sauerkraut, the nattokinase in natto, the glucuronic acid in kombucha, the live enzymes in miso, the allicin in fermented garlic, are fragile in ways industrial food processing was never designed to respect. Pasteurization, applying heat sufficient to kill all microorganisms, was designed for shelf stability. It does that perfectly. It also destroys completely every live culture in the process. The difference between raw unpasteurized sauerkraut and the shelf-stable canned version isn't a small nutritional difference like slightly more or less fiber. One contains billions of live organisms doing complex biological work in your gut. The other shares a name with it. That's the entire extent of their resemblance. This principle, that industrial-scale processing destroys the very properties making traditional food medicinal, answers a question scientists have puzzled over for decades. Why do traditional populations eating these foods live longer, get less chronic disease, have lower autoimmune rates? Not because the foods are exotic. Because they're real. Because they haven't been processed into stability at the cost of vitality. The people who built these traditions, who made sauerkraut through German winters, ate miso every morning for 1,000 years, kept fermented garlic and honey as household medicine, had generations of careful observation. Modern science with double-blind studies and mass spectrometry is now methodically explaining mechanisms traditional cultures never needed to name. The wisdom was always there. The question we're sitting with is simply this. At what point did we decide food should last forever on a shelf? And what did we give up in exchange for that convenience? If this conversation matters to you, hit like and subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with which one surprised you most or which you're already eating. Tell me what to explore next. New content comes out every week and we are just getting started.